I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Hey, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like Live. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Happy to be your host. Please, of course, go to imixwhatilike.org and make sure you're subscribed there so you don't miss all of the stuff we do on these live streams across multimedia with my little crew and some colleagues. And by the way, this is going to be there's a very shortly going to be a big announcement about some of that where some exciting new developments are coming. So in part because of some longstanding work that we've been trying to do there, but also honestly because of some of the positive response we've gotten since we sort of moved over to this platform of live streaming and getting some members at the YouTube channel. And we want to expand on that almost immediately with some folks doing some similar work. So at the moment, I can't say much more than that, but please do continue to like, share, and subscribe and become a member and do all of those things. We are looking to expand this little operation as we have been really for a couple of decades now in various other spaces into something else. And I think we've got something coming up that's pretty hot. So please stay tuned for that. Also, of course, make sure that you understand that a lot of the support, if not all of the support you do offer financially or as becoming a member is going to the support of political prisoners, directly or indirectly, a variety of them that are still locked up and in need of some attention. So, of course, the JerichoMovement.com is one outlet we're supporting, Prison Radio. Another, the Abolitionist Law Center, who will be joining us here not too long from now, and the Jailhouse Lawyers. They're going to be joining us as well here in the not too distant future as well. So please, continue to support for those reasons at least. Similarly, later today, we're going to be talking about reparations with Professor Arajo, and I got to get that name correct, so she'll check me on that at 5 o'clock Eastern, and then at 6 o'clock right after that, we're going to wrap up the day with Black Agenda Report's Margaret Kimberly. And as she was already messaging me after giving what's happening yesterday, there's a lot more new to talk about. And by the way, all I want to say about that right now, because I know with our next guest, we have many other things that I want to talk with him about, although if he wants to chime in on this, he's more than welcome. I just wanted to say that of the many responses to be had to yesterday's activities in DC is one more display of this country's true nature, and that nature is often protected. That is, that this nature is often protected by a soft, liberal, and disingenuous self-righteous indignation at having the normal and quieter flow of oppression and exploitation just happen to be interrupted. And what so many who get the biggest microphones are really complaining about right now is just the noise, not at what is actually being broken or what is in fact broken. So the very leadership that should be being condemned at this moment is in the end ultimately reaffirmed by reminding us of what should be happening in terms of what they consider to be normal. So anyway, we'll talk more about that later on. So please stick around for that, particularly with our conversation with Margaret Kimberly. And by the way, on the 14th of January, speaking of political prisoners, we have a special event coming up as well. Anyway, so there's a lot of stuff coming, so stick around. So anyway, my next guest is, I know many of you know of him already. I can tell by the uptick in live viewers right now that many of you know him already. I'm just seeing that. So shout out to him for bringing us some more viewers as well. But he's an award-winning journalist with The Nation, of course, GrayZone News, and is host there of the show PushBack. He is Aaron Mate. Welcome, Aaron, to the program. Thanks again for joining me and us. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Jared. Thanks for having me.
So listen, I was thinking, man, there's so many jokes I've been having in the thought of the run up to your visit here, which I'm very happy about. And one of them was, I was thinking about how Keegan Michael Key was calling Aaron Rodgers the Aaron of quarterbacking in football. And I did happen to think, it did cross my mind that I should start calling you the Aaron of media and journalism, and certainly of RussiaGate debunking. Anyway, I couldn't help that, man. Hey, listen, so one of the reasons why I was very excited to have you join me here is because honestly, a couple of years ago, someone who I describe as one of my New York Times liberal colleagues was at work with me, just sharing me with his views of the world. And he kept dropping all these references to Russia doing everything, and Russia, Russia, and Russia. And I just kept saying, at the time I wasn't really paying attention, honestly. And I said, listen, what evidence is there that this is happening? Like, I see the news, I'm hearing reporting, I watch some of the mainstream press and some of the discussion, even among some of my colleagues at work, but nobody was actually pointing to any evidence, any actual evidence. So I says, well, how do we know? And they just kept regurgitating the same platitudes and headlines and whatever summaries they were getting from the New York Times, wherever else this was being covered. And then finally somebody said, man, you should check out Aaron Mate's work. I think you would, get what you're looking for. And I did. And it was dense, and it was deep, and it was rich, and it was revealing. And immediately gave me everything I needed to go back to my friends at work with, although it didn't work. Even with the evidence you laid out, the messaging was already taking effect. So I just wanted you, if you could, in the simplest way, lay out what it was that was wrong with that story that is obviously still going, and what is it that you found, and then maybe we'll talk more about the resistance to what you found in terms of it being reported or accepted as part of the narrative.
Well, what happened yesterday is a good illustration of why the Russia obsession has been so stupid and so detrimental. So, for example, instead of talking about the serious systemic dysfunctions in this country that led to the rise of Donald Trump, his election, that led to the appeal of his white supremacist message and his far right agenda, liberals have spent 4 years, for the most part, focused on blaming Russia for all this, saying that Vladimir Putin was fueling discord in the U.S. He was pitting Americans against each other. He was the one sort of helping to foment white supremacy. And all of this served a very convenient agenda for the neoliberals who lost to Trump, of instead of looking at the system that gave rise to him and their own power within that system, instead, Russia was used as a foil. So everything was deflected onto Russia, to the point where, even yesterday, you saw all these liberal luminaries like Ben Rhodes, who was Obama's foreign policy wizard, assistant, speechwriter. Samantha Power also served under Obama as his UN ambassador. All these media figures, Greg Miller from the Washington Post, MSNBC analyst Joyce Vance, all of them couldn't help themselves from talking about what a good day this was for Putin. And all of this was exactly what Vladimir Putin wanted. As if yesterday has anything to do with Russia and Vladimir Putin. And the reason why they bring up Russia and Vladimir Putin is not because Putin has anything to do with U.S. dysfunctions. It's because, it serves, again, two functions. One, it deflects serious reflection on the dysfunctions and failures of the U.S. system. And two, it prevents these people who benefit from that system, from power in that system, from doing any reflection that threatens their own privilege and power. And that is the main dynamic that I think drove RussiaGate for 4 years, coupled with an additional factor, which is that all these people have a extreme dedication to imperialism, and Russia in some areas, especially when it comes to a place like Syria and in Ukraine, is an impediment to U.S. imperialism. It's a deterrent in some areas to U.S. hegemony. And so there is an imperative there for all these people to demonize Russia as much as possible and to criminalize diplomacy with Russia. And it was considered this a huge affront to these people that Donald Trump called for having better relations with Russia. He wanted to get along with Russia, which I personally thought was a good idea. Now, what these people couldn't see is that while Trump was saying this, he never, I think, had any real strong political conviction in it. And as soon as he came to office, he appointed a bunch of neocons who proceeded to oversee a radical escalation of tensions with Russia and an even hawkish posture towards Russia than even Obama had, because Trump himself doesn't really have any real beliefs, and he ultimately will cater to his far right crowd. But for these people that wasn't enough. Just the fact that Trump was nice to Vladimir Putin in public and was talking rhetorically about getting along with Russia, that still, that was too far for them. Like, that was a red line. So diplomacy with Russia was criminalized, and this dumb conspiracy theory that Trump was a Russian agent was used as a means to oppose Trump rather than focus on the systemic dysfunctions of this country that gave rise to him. Because again, just to underscore this, to focus on those systemic dysfunctions of the U.S. power system would have threatened the privilege and power that these liberal figures enjoy within that system.
Yeah, no, I mean, anyway, so listen, I titled this segment, this visit of yours to this platform, after a statement that I got from someone I saw you pay tribute to in a recent program of yours, Stephen F. Cohen. And admittedly, I didn't know much about him or his work before coming across your own a little while ago. And I wanted to say, my condolences to you and to his extended crew and support network and family and whatever, because again, I didn't know much about him, but I felt your very impassioned tribute to him in setting up that interview. But, anyways, but when I went to just, try to get it somewhat prepared for today, I was looking at went back and looked at what he wrote, and just his opening, I believe it's the opening paragraph from his May 2019 Nation article, where he says that, quote, it cannot be emphasized too often, RussiaGate allegations that the American president has been compromised by the Kremlin, which may even have helped to put him in the White House, is the worst, and considering the lack of actual evidence, most fraudulent political scandal in American history. We have yet to calculate the damage RussiaGate has inflicted on America's democratic institutions, including the presidency and the electoral process, and on democratic and foreign perceptions of American democracy, or on U.S.-Russian relations at a critical moment when both sides having modernized their nuclear weapons, are embarking on a new, more dangerous, and largely underreported arms race, end quote. So I wanted you to maybe talk with us a little bit more about Stephen Cohen and his work, and specifically this point that he was making, that because immediately I started just going through trying to go through the Rolodex of American political scandals, and was wondering if in fact he's right about this being the most fraudulent political scandal in American history. But anyway, could you talk to us a little bit about Cohen and his relationship to this story and the work that you've been doing, and then maybe specifically about his point about this being the most fraudulent?
Right. Well, look, there certainly was massive fraud. Okay. Oh, sorry, Jared. It lagged there a little bit, so I missed probably the last 10 seconds of your.
Yeah, I was just asking you to tell us about Cohen a little bit and the context of his work as it relates to yours, and then this question specifically about his point about it being the most fraudulent scandal.
So Stephen F. Cohen, who passed away in September at the age of 81, he was just an eminent Russia scholar. He was professor emeritus at NYU and Princeton. He briefed the first President Bush at the end of the Cold War. He was an expert on CBS News talking about, U.S.-Russia relations. He was, one of these eminent figures in the academy who was widely cited and who actually really shaped the field of Russian studies, and especially in the Soviet era, where he wrote a book that really changed people's understanding of the nature of the Soviet system. And he pointed out that there were alternatives to Stalinism that were crushed. And he wrote a number of books that were just very influential. But around 2014, he became a black sheep, and he became vigorously attacked. And all of a sudden, kind of his detractors did their best to push him out of the respectable circles, because when the U.S. helped organize a coup in Ukraine on Russia's doorstep, Cohen pointed out that Russia was responding rationally when it, retook Crimea, which was initially given to Ukraine by the Soviet Union. Russian forces did not invade Crimea. They were already there. And Vladimir Putin, I think, understandably was afraid that, with the coup mongers in Ukraine talking about joining NATO, which was a pretty obvious U.S. goal at the time, that they didn't want to see lose a military port right on their doorstep to a potentially new NATO country. And so, Cohen would just point out that Russia was reacting rationally to a coup that the U.S. had helped promote. So Victoria Nuland, who recently got appointed to serve under Joe Biden, she was going over with Senator Chris Murphy and John McCain, and they were handing out cookies and encouraging protesters in Maidan Square who were trying to overthrow the government. And, there was some genuine concern about corruption because the government that they were protesting in Ukraine was corrupt. But it wasn't just that. There also was this far right element that doesn't want to see Ukraine have any kind of like friendly ties to Russia and doesn't want to recognize the existence of millions of people in Ukraine who speak Russian and who ethnically identify with Russia. Ukraine is a very split country. There are people with ancestral ties to Russia and people who come from the far right who loathe Russia and want to kind of purge Ukraine of any kind of Russian identity. So we took the side, the U.S. took the side of the far right anti-Russian fascists, basically, and that's who we installed in government. And because Stephen F. Cohen opposed that, and then when Russia intervened in Syria, because in the words of Secretary of State John Kerry, Russia didn't want to see an ISIS government because the U.S. was watching by. This is what Kerry said in a leaked phone call. There's audio. The U.S. was basically watching ISIS encroach on Damascus. And the U.S. hope was that that would put Assad in such a weak position that he would negotiate his way out of power, while meanwhile the U.S. was spending billions of dollars to fund and arm other jihadist groups fighting Assad in Syria. So Russia intervened to put a stop to that because they didn't want to see an ISIS government. And then the demonization of Russia really, really ramped up even more. And Cohen again pushed back against that. And for that, he was even pushed out of progressive circles as well. So he used to be a regular guest on Democracy Now! And actually that's where I met him because I worked there for 10 years. But once he started calling that out, he wasn't welcome there anymore either. And this was just a part of a general trend in progressive circles, unfortunately, that really accepted credulously so much of the propaganda that has been used to wage this new Cold War that Stephen F. Cohen was challenging. So it was interesting these last few years to see this guy who was, so influential in the academy getting attacked, not just by, people in the mainstream called a Putin apologist. There were hit pieces on him written in the Daily Beast and other outlets, but even in progressive circles as well. But the guy was principled and he wasn't threatened by all these attacks. As he said to me, he's like, I'm old, I have good health care, so what do I care? And so he infuriated all these people because he was sticking to the facts and his principles. And so for that, people tried to really demonize him. So in the last few years, I had many opportunities to interview him because there was so much to respond to. And it was just strange that as part of this rightward drift, even inside liberal progressive spaces, there wasn't that much room left for him. And that's why he was just so appreciated by people who followed his work because he was such a good scholar and his books are so important, but he also he had rare courage and principle, and he was just masterful in how he delivered the facts. So in terms of RussiaGate, he also very early on called that out for what it was. He pointed out the lack of evidence. And he also pointed out that, look, even if everything that is that Russia was accused of was correct, that the hyperbole and the mania about it was so ridiculous. So look, the collusion thing, we know that to be now baseless. But look, there's still also are these allegations that Russia was destroying our democracy because they allegedly stole some emails from the Democrats, and this Russian troll farm put up some dumb social media ads on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And, Cohen was pointing out, people are comparing this to Pearl Harbor and wanting us to retaliate against Russia, and have they lost their minds? And when you look at the actual facts of these allegations themselves, I'm personally skeptical that Russia even stole the emails. And you look at the social media posts, it's clear that had nothing to do with the Russian government, or at least there's no evidence that had anything to do with the Russian government. But look, even if it was all true, even if the Kremlin did all of this, the fact that we're going to compare stealing emails and social media posts to Pearl Harbor and 9/11, I mean, it's insane. And again, it goes back to what I talked about before. It has nothing to do with a genuine concern. It has to do with the interest that these allegations serve. They deflect from the fact that Democrats lost to a clown, Donald Trump. They deflect from having to look at the real problems that gave rise to Donald Trump and the real problems with this system. And they also encourage a demonization of Russia that ultimately is good for imperialism. It's good for weapons manufacturers, but it's bad for everybody else. And what is amazing to me is how many progressives and liberals got duped by this. So you have liberals saying the stupidest things I've ever heard them say. So Hillary Clinton literally said over and over and over that the reason black people didn't vote for her in Michigan was because of Russian social media ads, right? Which is not just stupid, it's also straight up racist. Because how much racist contempt are you showing for black voters in Michigan to say that the reason they didn't vote for Hillary is because they got duped by some dumb Russian social media ads? So you have this like open display of not just stupidity, but outright racist contempt for black voters, in the Midwest, and they said this in Wisconsin as well. Every time there would be a study coming out about like Russian social media ads in the election, then you'd have people like David Axelrod saying, minority turnout did decline under, like from Obama to Clinton, and you have to wonder, although we can't say for sure, you have to wonder if Russian social media ads was the deciding factor here. You look at, there's been this whole industry of studies funded to basically make this argument. And you have, New York Times articles about this. I mean, just Google, black voters and Russian social media ads, and you'll see all these headlines about how it was Russians that convinced black people not to vote for Saint Hillary. It's like, it's just insane. But then look at how many progressives and liberals went along with it, not seeing the obvious stupidity and racism. And so, the most interesting part to me of RussiaGate is what it says about our liberal culture and how out of touch it is, and the lengths that it will go to avoid any honest self-reflection that threatens its own privilege and power.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I was saying it even at the top of this interview, was that the frustration, just looking, even I was even trying to look at sports coverage, and I couldn't even avoid it there this morning. Everybody just basically, the basic wave of argumentation is, if we could just get back to the normalcy of Biden and the Democratic Party, all of these problems will go away. And it's also funny that at the time I was trying to catch up to all of your work on RussiaGate, I happened all at the same time, I read Alfred and Secker's National Security Cinema, and where they were talking about all of the intelligence agency influence over entertainment, television, and movies, and specifically the show Homeland. And then I happened to turn on just to check it, and it's kind of crazy. I didn't really watch the show much, but I happened to turn on that particular season, and one of the themes of that season was Russian propaganda was stoking internal hatred and discord in the United States. And I was just thinking, and so as I'm looking at your work, and then even on MSNBC, they started parroting the whole useful idiots thing. And then I know that became, and I know that's why, Matt Taibbi and Katie Halper do the ironic use of that name for their podcast. But I'm just, it's anyway. So when I would go back, anyway, just to go bring my story full circle, when I would go back to my work and my colleagues and just try to have friendly conversations and ask my academic colleagues why they were not going beyond the surface, the fundamental point was, well, the New York Times is saying it, the MSNBC, they're just saying it, so it must be true. So I thought that anyway. So,
and that's a problem with liberal culture, where basically it's a club, and people want membership. So membership is defined by whether or not you read the New York Times, you're published in the Atlantic magazine. There are a lot of people in academia and media who really want that, and they derive some self-worth from that. And I think that those of us who don't, that just makes it a lot easier to look at the truth properly, because we don't. I mean, I don't want to be a part of that, you know, which makes it so when I get the contempt from that crowd, I welcome it, because it's just so, you know, that's just not how I derive my meaning from acceptance into that circle. But unfortunately, it became so powerful that even something so stupid and so ridiculous became so widely accepted. And I shouldn't just say stupid, by the way. It's also sinister, because you look at, you know, there's so many think tanks and these weird private firms that became deeply involved in this RussiaGate cottage industry. You have all these weird firms like something called New Knowledge, which did the study for the Senate on Russian social media. And then you look at who they are, and they're people who come from the State Department. They're obviously, you know, if not directly spooks, they have spook connections. They have ties to intelligence people, and often, you know, you have all these different cutouts. This is intelligence history, where sometimes intelligence agencies don't directly do something, but they'll use cutouts to put forward a message for them. And it's obvious that so many of these types of characters were used in RussiaGate. They became analysts on MSNBC. Their studies are used to justify all this. And it's an industry. It's profitable. A lot of money was spent on these people. So, you know, and the New York Times then, for example, will go around and then treat these people as experts. So if you read a New York Times article about Russian propaganda or Russian disinformation, they'll always have a quote in there from some sort of expert, someone with a senior fellowship at some fancy sounding think tank. You go deep, and I guarantee you every single time you'll find some kind of like military industrial complex government connection there in terms of the funding or the personnel and their background, because it's a racket. All this thing was a privilege protection racket and an imperial racket, because what this always promoted was increased hostility towards Russia. And when you have increased hostility towards Russia, you have increased spending on weapons, you have increased spending on the intelligence agencies, and you have just this heightened chauvinism that all of this supported.
Well, you know, I want to get to one more issue that you have been covering that kind of has had you in that same sort of disfavor with that sort of in crowd you're talking about. But I wanted to quickly say as a transition that I watched actually for a long time, since I first saw him on Democracy Now!, admittedly some years ago. I've become a fan of your father's work as well, and read at least one of his books, and been trying to watch, you know, a number of the videos, including one that you and he did not too long ago, which I thought was another powerful discussion. And the quick notes I pulled from it that I think relate to this discussion of the response to RussiaGate was that you and your father talked about the, and that is Gabor Mate, if I'm pronouncing his name right, by the way, the eminent psychiatrist or psychologist. I can't. Is it?
He's just he actually isn't a psychiatrist, or I mean, he's a therapist. He certainly works in mental health, but he's just a retired physician. Yeah.
Well, anyway, but anyway, the general approach from what I remember from his work that I really appreciate is just always trying to remind people that all the symptoms people want to treat are symptoms largely based on what society is doing to people, which is I just really appreciate that. But he said something in your discussion related to your disagreement over the predictions around Obama. And by the way, your father was right. He was right about Obama. But he was talking about this issue of people basing conclusions on emotions.
Yeah.
And when he said that, I thought immediately to, you know, what is supposed to be one of my professional fields of media studies, which is exactly how, you know, where they talk a lot about it. This is exactly how advertising and marketing work. Of course, Obama was marketed as a brand, as a product, and so are ideas and even propagandized stories like RussiaGate. They're marketed. It's almost like they're not selling even that Putin and the Russians did something. They're really selling the idea that, you know, America is the lone beacon of light that's being assaulted by, I mean, they're selling all these other larger branded concepts. So anyway, I don't know if there's anything you would want to say about that conversation or that point I'm making, or that I'm actually taking from what your father said, but but I just thought I would want to highlight it, and it anyway seems relevant. So
well,
I
no,
appreciate
totally.
it.
Yeah, I mean, look, just going, and it touches on what I was trying to say before, which is that to seriously grapple with Donald Trump's victory would have had to have meant for Democrats acknowledging that Obama was a failure. I mean, not only did they lose seats at all levels, but the fact is Donald Trump won by running against the Obama-Clinton legacy. That's just a fact. And it wasn't just racism. Racism was a part of it, but you also had a considerable amount of Obama voters going over to Trump. So you can't just blame racism for Trump's victory. It was a part of it, but it wasn't just that. There also was the fact that Donald Trump presented himself falsely as an opponent of the neoliberal establishment that Obama and Clinton represented, and he was going to drain the swamp. And he duped enough people into believing that because they had, I guess, such low confidence in the Democrats. And so to seriously reckon with the lessons of Trump's victory would have meant looking honestly at Obama's record. But because of this brand that's been built up around Obama, that's become that's a red line. You don't do that. You don't question Obama. You don't question his legacy of promising hope and change, but doing nothing and really just continuing the system with, some slight cosmetic changes in certain areas and some things that were half decent, but, still a lot of horrible things, especially, by the way, I think on foreign policy, where, it was under him that the U.S. destroyed Libya, conducted the dirty war on Syria, authorized the Saudi invasion of Yemen. You can go on and on. But so, yeah, I think RussiaGate was a big part of that. It was a way to avoid seriously confronting the real legacy of Obama. And it meant that it really perverted the resistance to Trump, because instead of resisting Trump based on his cronyism, his attacks on the working class, his awful foreign policy, resisting Donald Trump meant basically watching MSNBC and waiting for Robert Mueller to, find the smoking gun. That's what resistance to Trump came about. It became the most neutralized resistance I've actually ever seen, to the point where, and this is a point I harp on a lot because to me it's so illustrative. There were bigger liberal protests to save Jeff Sessions' job than there were to save the Iran nuclear deal, or even to save the Affordable Health Care Act. Where when Jeff Sessions got fired by Trump right after the November 2018 midterm elections, liberals in multiple cities rallied, held huge not massive, because who's going to come out to that except for diehard RussiaGators, but literally hundreds of cities, there were protests against the firing of Jeff Sessions. That's what resistance in the Trump era, because of neoliberal co-opting, was reduced to. Rallying to save Jeff Sessions' job. It's really, really disgusting, and we still have not properly reckoned with that. And to the point where, look, even when Trump got impeached, some people welcome that as this wonderful thing to hold Trump to account. Well, what was he really impeached for? He was impeached for encouraging someone else to investigate another member of the ruling elite, Joe Biden. And you can't do that. You can attack working people if you're a president like Trump did, but you can't possibly attack another member of the elite, another member of the club. And also because he briefly paused sending some weapons to Ukraine. And these weapons, by the way, were weapons that Obama, after he started the whole mess in Ukraine, Obama actually refused to send those weapons because he realized that he had started a useless proxy war, and that the weapons that we were sending over were actually going to neo-Nazis inside the Ukrainian military. And Obama wisely decided he didn't want to fuel that further. When Trump got into office, he immediately faced all this pressure to sell those weapons to Ukraine. And the difference this time is that Trump is being accused of being a Russian agent. So I think to help placate that and cater to it, Trump caved and authorized these weapon sales. He then briefly pauses them, and that triggers impeachment. And impeachment became not trying to hold Trump for any of his real abuses of power, but trying to attack him for, literally Adam Schiff was going up and saying that we have to fight the Russians over there so we don't fight them over here. And he was talking, they were quoting Ronald Reagan, saying that we're the shining city on the hill.
Right, that's it. Yeah.
Even this you know, on the surface, this act of standing up to Trump and holding him to account, impeachment, which is, a serious act, even that was co-opted and turned into another chauvinist militarist display, because that's what the resistance in the Trump era was about, because anything otherwise would have meant seriously talking about real issues. And they can't do that because Democrats under Obama and Clinton were so bad on those issues. So they don't have anything to offer people there. So instead they turn to stuff like this.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's the same thing I was saying to your GrayZone colleague, Max Blumenthal, about the work that you all do. Sometimes it's just dizzying to try to keep up in light of what is often heavily promoted outside. And if you don't, if anyway, so excuse me, even as I'm focused on making fun of my New York Times liberal friend, the reality is one of the problems that I've had is that the belief in this has really seeped into even more leftist and radical spaces throughout multiple communities, and people just take it for granted. Even if they want to seemingly apply a more militant analysis to it, they're still accepting it as a given. And I'm sitting there saying, man, we're not paying enough attention, and our attention is being suppressed underneath a whole wave of silly narratives and dominant narratives. But the one other one I wanted to at least have you talk a little bit about, if you could, is where you found yourself again, and from my perspective, at least, in a similar position, trying to combat these powerful narratives, is around the Syria scandal, the bombing and the OPCW. And I know you testified recently at the UN around this as well. Could you, again, assuming that for instance, I want to use this conversation for my upcoming class on public opinion and persuasion. And I know that I'm going to have my students looking at a lot of coverage as it had happened around, or is happening around, Syria and the OPCW and the bomb and all this stuff around Assad and all this stuff. But if you were starting to talk to an introductory level college class and saying, look, I know you've seen some of the earlier reports about the barrel bombs and the gas but here's some, how would you approach someone who is not really paying attention, but getting those basic stories, dominant stories, and laying it out, leading us to your testimony at the UN?
Well, what I would say is that we live in a heavily propagandized country. And there's a reason for that. Is we're the heart of the empire. And so the US conducts these operations all around the world, destabilizing and overthrowing governments. And to do that, they need at least the tacit consent of their own population. So we are targeted constantly with so much media propaganda. And just the fact is the reality of our media system is that so many media outlets are embedded with that, because to succeed inside the system, it helps to cater to the narratives of power. So in the case of Syria, we've been presented with a certain narrative for a decade now. It's a decade this year that the dirty war began.
Wow, right, yeah.
And it's so powerful that even someone like me, who is a committed leftist, I've been involved in media for close to 20 years, always on the progressive side, over 10 years of Democracy Now!, The Real News in Baltimore, so I consider myself a progressive and informed. But even me, I got duped by some of the Syria propaganda because it was just that overwhelming. And I didn't do enough independent research to really come to my own conclusions, which does take time. And part of the problem is that not everyone has the time to do that, especially, if you're not working in media, it's just very difficult to find the time to do the research you need to do to understand every single issue and to break through the propaganda machine that distorts the perspective on every single issue. So in the case of Syria, the facts are this, is that in 2011, during the Arab Spring, protests broke out in Syria, calling for democratic reforms. And, understandably, because they're living under an authoritarian government. That's what the Assad government is. They've been in power for a very long time. So these protests were calling for democratic reforms. But what gets missed, unfortunately, in all this coverage is that meanwhile there also was a heavily sectarian element to other protesters who were calling not just for democratic reforms, but were also chanting sectarian lines like Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the grave, because there is a sectarian divide inside Syria that exists, and it was exploited by foreign powers like the US, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and France and the UK, who basically took advantage of the protests. And in the media narrative, they conflated those protests for democratic reforms with this sectarian agenda and with a regime change agenda, which was not the agenda of all the protesters. Again, some of them just wanted democratic reforms to an authoritarian regime. And what this became very quickly was a dirty war where the US and its allies flooded the country with billions of dollars worth of weapons. They let jihadist fighters pouring across the Turkish border, coming from around the world. So many of these fighters weren't even Syrian. They came from around the world. And they waged a sadistic, dirty war that destroyed the country. And meanwhile, the propaganda that we were getting is that freedom fighters and rebels on our side were fighting this like sadistic, genocidal regime, when really what was actually happening was the Syrian government and its allies, Iran, Hezbollah, and later Russia, were responding to a war that was imposed on them. And of course, in the process, they certainly committed many war crimes and human rights abuses. It is an authoritarian government. But what we missed in all this was our role in fueling this war and the war crimes and abuses of the people that we were arming and supporting. And what no one ever questions in media discussions is, what right do we have to destroy a country whose government we don't like? And what right do we have to send billions of dollars worth of weapons into a foreign country? You know, would we want that to happen to us? According to the New York Times, this was the most one of the most expensive covert operations in CIA history. One out of every $15 in the CIA's budget was spent on this dirty war. It was at one point, according to the Washington Post, the budget was approximately $1 billion a year. So just ask yourselves, knowing what we know about the CIA, what are the odds that this is a noble venture if we're spending $1 billion a year in a foreign country? But unfortunately, so much propaganda was imposed on us, and so many leftist outlets got duped by it into thinking that we were on the side of these freedom-loving rebels. When really, you look at on the ground who they were, and the people we were arming and supporting were sectarian fanatics. And there's a great article I recommend, which really influenced my own thinking on this topic. It's called Aleppo After the Fall by Robert F. Worth in the New York Times Magazine in April 2017. And he points out, he talks about an incident in a town called Latakia, which is mostly Alawite, which is the sect that Assad belongs to. And Worth says that the rebels that the U.S. was arming and supporting were closing in on Latakia. And he says that if they were successful, the result would almost certainly have been sectarian mass murder. And that's who we were supporting. We were supporting sectarian mass murder. That's who we supported and Turkey supported in Aleppo. And that's who we were supporting in Latakia, where thankfully they got stopped. But the media pretty much buried that, except for a few principled and honest reporters like Robert F. Worth. And that's what got lost. And so one manifestation of this is the story that I've gotten very involved with, which is the OPCW scandal, where at a certain point,
can I just interrupt very quickly, just so, because I didn't make it clear, that's the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is, I always forget what the acronym actually stands for. So just in case I'm not the only one, people will.
Yeah. And the OPCW actually has had previously a very noble record in Syria, because at a certain point, Assad is being helped by Iran and Hezbollah, and they're winning the war. They're turning back the U.S.-backed rebels, and by the way, you know, we should think about what the motives were here for this war. It was not to bring democracy to Syria. I mean, A, we don't have that right, and B, the people we were supporting were jihadists, including Al-Qaeda. In fact, Jake Sullivan, who was about to come in under the Obama administration, he wrote a famous email to Hillary Clinton where he said to her, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Okay. So he put it best. That's who we were supporting, Al-Qaeda. Okay. But then you have to wonder, so what was the real agenda? And basically, because it's a fair question, it should be asked. I think the agenda was, Syria has been in the regime change crosshairs for a long time. General Wesley Clark named it on his list of countries that he said were the targets of regime change by Bush. WikiLeaks cables that were put out show that the U.S. has been meeting with Syrian opposition activists and talking about fomenting regime change for a long time. So this was nothing new. And also Syria was a key ally of Iran and Hezbollah. And I think what the agenda here was to basically destroy a state that was allied with groups in the case of Hezbollah and states in the case of Iran that acted as a deterrent to U.S. hegemony in the region and Israeli violence in the region, because these states can fight back. And so targeting Syria, where weapons are transferred to Hezbollah, was I think a strategic choice in that respect. And also drawing Iran in would bleed Iran in the same way that the U.S. bled the Soviets in Afghanistan. So when people ask that question, that to me, I think, was the basic goal. But then you get to the chemical weapons issue. So, in 2013, there was a horrific chemical weapons attack in Ghouta, close to Damascus in Syria. Hundreds of people were killed with sarin. And immediately the Syrian government was accused. And immediately the Obama administration basically said that it was going to bomb, because Obama had laid down this red line. If you remember, he said that if we start, he was facing pressure to intervene in Syria. He didn't want to do that because he knew that basically intervention would be catastrophic and lead to the rise of Al-Qaeda taking over. But he resisted that. But he did made some comment about, if I see chemical weapons being used, that's a red line, and that would invite U.S. military intervention. Well, as one U.S. ambassador told Charles Glass of Harper's Magazine in an article in 2019, the red line was an open invitation to a false flag. Because if you're on the militant rebel side and you see Obama say, I will only intervene under this one condition, then you're then incentivized to basically make that condition happen. And that is what I believe actually occurred. So Syria was accused of carrying out this sarin attack. And Obama was preparing to bomb and he was gearing up for it. But then at the last minute, he pulled back and he reached this agreement with Russia and the OPCW to destroy all of Syria's chemical weapons arsenal. So the OPCW was then involved in, I think, a really noble achievement, something that destroyed chemical weapons and prevented war. And later we found out from Seymour Hersh, another legend like Stephen Cohen, who's become a pariah in some circles because he challenges dominant propaganda. We found out from him that what actually happened was U.S. intelligence had come to their own conclusions that the evidence was not there for Assad being guilty, and that in fact the evidence was there pointing to the fact that Al-Qaeda, the rebels, had done this for several reasons. One, the sarin that was found in Ghouta was studied by Porton Down, a British military lab, and they found that the sarin that was found in Ghouta did not match the sarin found that the sarin found in Ghouta did not match the sarin that was in the Syrian government's arsenal. They also found in intelligence that Al-Qaeda was working with Turkey to produce sarin. And then Professor Ted Postel, who's an MIT physicist, he pointed out that the rockets that hit Ghouta had to have been launched from rebel-controlled territory. They had to have been, based on the aerodynamics. And at the last minute, basically, we found out later on that James Clapper, this was in the Atlantic magazine, James Clapper went to Obama and said, the intelligence here is not a slam dunk. So that's what really happened behind the scenes. And Obama claimed that he didn't do it because he couldn't get congressional authorization. That's just not true. They knew they didn't have the intelligence and they didn't want to cause another disaster like Iraq. So the OPCW was used there for a noble purpose. But fast forward to 2018. And again, now we're under Trump, and Trump has also vowed to impose the red line. He already did so once in 2017 when Syria was accused of a chemical attack in a town called Khan Sheikhoun. And once again, in this town called Douma, which is another Damascus suburb, the Syrian government is accused once again of a chemical weapons attack. And before even the OPCW can come in to inspect, Trump bombed Syria along with the UK and France. And about a year later, in March 2019, the OPCW puts out a report saying that there are reasonable grounds to believe that a chemical attack occurred with chlorine. And if you can deduce from what they say based on the cylinders found at the scene that they're basically blaming the Syrian government without officially stating it. So basically, the OPCW report supports the Trump administration's line. Then we find out from leaks that start to emerge that the actual inspectors who went to Syria reached a radically different conclusion, that they found no evidence that the Syrian government was guilty here, and they found some strong evidence that this was staged, which again, strategically makes perfect sense, because if you're Syria and you're about to retake a town, why would you do the one thing that you know will invite U.S. military strikes? Just even forgetting all the evidence, just from rationality, it makes absolutely no sense. But all that was ignored because of this rush to support war and to support the sadistic torment of a state that fought back against our dirty war. And the chemical weapons allegations are a big part of that, and a big part of the justification used to sustain it. So these OPCW inspectors who went there, they reached a different conclusion, but these leaks that we got continuously showed that their superiors overruled them, censored their evidence, and then sidelined them from their own investigation. Basically took them off the case and put in people who never stepped foot in Syria, basically. And that's what the scandal has exposed. It's an amazing story. It's kind of like Iraq WMDs once again, where you have this allegation against a country used to justify military strikes that is then undermined by the evidence. And this time it's even stronger because we have actual whistleblowers on the inside who investigated it. But not only have they been silenced in their own organization, but you look at media coverage, and it's as if these whistleblowers don't even exist. These veteran inspectors who've been with the OPCW since the start, very credentialed. You look at media coverage, and there's even a refusal to acknowledge their existence. And to the extent that it is discussed in Western media, it's all portrayed to us as the product of a Russian or Syrian disinformation campaign, which ties back to RussiaGate, where basically anything that we don't like can be attributed to Russia. You know, we don't like the fact that there's racists in our country. Well, maybe Russia is fueling them. Liberal elites are uncomfortable with Black Lives Matter protests. Well, maybe Vladimir Putin's social media posts are fueling them, and the same thing here. So this OPCW thing actually ties into RussiaGate in that respect, where basically there's been this information war on the Western public to enroll them in regime change operations around the world, and anything that interferes with that narrative is simply ascribed to Russia.
Aaron, listen, we're approaching an hour. I just want to check how you are on time, because there's I have a couple more questions, but we can rush through them if I don't want to
No,
anyway.
I'm good. I have another half an hour.
Okay, cool. Listen, so first of all, one of the things that I, if I'm hearing you correctly, so first of all, I happen to be in this collective, the Organization for Propaganda Studies, Organization of Propaganda Studies, with Piers Robinson, and who I know. Well, actually, I don't know. He's been covering this from Europe.
Yeah,
and has been part of a group of academics who have been punished for raising some of these same questions and dismissed as conspiracy theorists. So it's well, anyway, I just know that's part of the defense of this position that's being promoted and why so much media coverage doesn't raise some of these critiques or offer these other bits of evidence. But I'm also hearing, if I'm hearing correctly, what you're saying about what first Obama was being pushed to, and then now what even Trump is being pushed to, that there is, regardless of who's in the office of the president, from wherever these centers of powers are, an interest in fomenting war, that there's an interest in pushing some sort of war, that whether it's Obama or Trump, if any president tries to be resistant to bombing somebody, they start to get some sort of negative reporting or description, or there's some sort of backlash. I don't really have a question. I don't know if there's anything you would want to say about that specific point, but it's just a theme that I heard developing in this conversation, and just wanted to make sure I was catching that correctly. And if not, to get checked on that. But anyway,
I mean, look, our intelligence agencies, quote unquote, have massive power to do whatever they want, and they followed a consistent agenda for decades, something much bigger than any individual president, which is they carry out catastrophic regime change and dirty wars abroad. And Syria was no different. And so from the point of view of the CIA, if you're spending $1 billion a year on an operation to destroy a foreign country, to destabilize it, then that just, that doesn't go away. Even when Trump came in, he was actually talking about pulling back support for the rebels. And, at that point, by the time he came in, the war was over. Russia and Syria won. But if you're the CIA and the national security state, the war doesn't stop. This is what they do. They spend $1 billion on this a year, and a lot of it, they funneled weapons from Libya to Syria. This was a huge operation. And by the way, meanwhile, the GrayZone, Ben Norton recently reported on this. The UK government spent tens of millions of dollars on propaganda, funding opposition Syria, media sites, as Western governments always do in all these regime change operations. So that just doesn't go away, even though Trump was talking about stopping it. And Trump came in and he did pull back some funding initially for the quote unquote rebels, but the regime change war continues anyway, even without him, like whether he wants to or not. So the US, and Trump is a perfect example. Trump talked about pulling out of Syria, and he even ordered the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria. What happened? He got undermined immediately, and U.S. troops are still there. And all of a sudden, Trump was saying, "Yeah, okay, fine, we're going to stay there, and we're going to protect the oil." Because of course, because he has, as I said before, he has no real convictions, and he has no interest in using any real political capital on anything substantive. He wants to be liked by his far right benefactors and his far right crowd, and so he'll even if he has an instinct, he'll immediately go back on it the moment he gets some pushback. And that's what happened to him on Syria.
And also with Afghanistan recently too, right? He said he wanted to talk about bringing troops home from Afghanistan, and everybody started pouncing on him again for the same thing. Yeah.
Anyway. And Congress stopped him from doing it. And look, in the case of Syria, you even had Trump's own envoy to the U.S. coalition in Syria, James Jeffrey. He openly bragged about the fact that his office was misleading the White House on how many troops were inside Syria, because he didn't want to encourage Trump's calls for withdrawal. So they actually told the White House that there are less U.S. troops in Syria than there actually were. So even national security state officials are openly bragging about misleading the president, which says something about where the real power lies. And also James Jeffrey also was openly bragging about, he said, "My job is to create a quagmire for the Russians in Syria." And he also bragged about the fact that the U.S., with its murderous sanctions that were imposed with overwhelming bipartisan consent, the Caesar sanctions, have basically destroyed further Syria's economy. And James Jeffrey was bragging about that, is that that's a wonderful achievement. So whatever Trump's intentions were, whatever he said in public, it doesn't really matter. These policies continue, and they accelerated under Trump because the U.S. is occupying a major part of Syria, and they're doing it just to keep Syria poor. As Professor Joshua Landis, the U.S.'s top Syria scholar, says, that the aim there is to basically keep Syria divided and poor, because the northeast part of Syria, where the U.S. is currently has troops, that has Syria's oil, and it also produces a major part of its wheat. So now Syrians are starving in their own country. They have to line up for hours to get bread because of the murderous U.S. sanctions, and because we're preventing them from accessing their own resources, including their own wheat. It's so sadistic. So it speaks to something much bigger than Trump. That's just the imperatives of the national security state in action.
So, as you were talking about all these stories, something occurred to me that again, it's something I always make reference to. Malcolm X said that the police do locally what the military does internationally, and I was just wondering. As I was thinking about that, I thought, what do you think that oppressed groups within the United States could learn about their struggles or relationship to the state or the state's media apparatus, based on the coverage that you all do and you have done personally on RussiaGate and Syria? In other words, are there themes that you've identified in the coverage on these issues abroad that people here could use or build from as they, again, try to develop an analysis of their relationship to the media system here or journalism here?
Well, one lesson for me from the RussiaGate era is that, neoliberals will use people of color when it serves their own interests, and they'll pretend to care about the interests of people of color and racism when it serves their interests, but they'll ignore it when it doesn't. So when it serves their interest to talk about Trump's racism towards Black people, they'll do it. But when Trump is being racist towards the people of Venezuela or any other global South country by, depriving them of food and medicine with murderous sanctions, they'll go along with it. They'll cheer it, kind of like yesterday where like Chris Murphy was condemning the attack on the Capitol. Well, when Trump launched a coup with Juan Guaido and tried to install Juan Guaido in Venezuela, and there were, and in Nicaragua, when they were putting up barricades around the country, burning people alive in the case of Venezuela, like a Black supporter of Chavismo was burned alive by the Venezuelan opposition. And that's who we support. So, I think that's an important lesson, that concern about racism amongst liberals here is so often cynically used for political purposes, not out of a genuine concern for racism. I don't think, and not that they need to learn that from me. I mean, that's very obvious, but especially you can learn a lot about people's genuine commitment to anti-racism when you ask whether they've applied it to any foreign country. And again, going back to what I said before about how, even look at how Black people were discussed in the RussiaGate era, where instead of saying, Black people didn't vote for Hillary Clinton for this reason, let's look at the reasons, let's to interview Black people and get their opinions about why they stayed home and didn't vote for this neoliberal warmonger, then let's just blame Russia for it. So even there, you had this open display of racist contempt for people of color and their concerns, and this elitist dismissal of them, and this insistence that they just got duped by Russia. So I think it's the RussiaGate era can teach us a lot about that. I guess for me, not being part of an oppressed class, I don't want to speak too much about it because I don't know how much I have to.
Well, but I mean, no, but I'm not. Well, yeah, no, I'm not asking you to do that. I was more in terms of an analysis of the media system and how reporting and propaganda works is really,
right, okay.
Just in terms of the process of how stories and narratives are generated. Because at least the parallel that I see, or at least one of them, is that something similar to what you said, that narratives of struggles overseas are constructed for very political purposes, and that's brought home here. And I don't always think, although it that there's enough criticism brought from within people struggling here to the way narratives here are constructed about those struggles. So that was really kind of the so the last question that I have, and then I haven't even really gone through too much of the comments in the chat there. We can maybe scroll through very quickly, but I did see one from my dear brother Kaba, who is a programmer, and I'm formerly with Pacifica Radio here in Washington, D.C., often following your former employer, Democracy Now! And over the last, I don't know, maybe I started listening in the late 90s, and I had noticed that there, a shift to the center in their coverage, and we're both very critical of their coverage of a lot of things in general, including of Syria. And then I don't know when I passed through the Real News and when you did, but similar to my time, my time there, I had very similar concerns and criticisms about ways stories were promoted, constructed, told, what stories were literally shut down, etc. But I'm just wondering if there's anything you would or you have said publicly about these alternative spaces that you have either worked for or worked with or pay attention to, that maybe, and what you see lacking in there. You don't have to be specific about Democracy Now! If you don't want, but what you may see lacking in some of those spaces, maybe that has even precipitated your work with the GrayZone. I don't know if there's a direct connection there or not, but because I noticed a difference, a substantive difference in what you all do with the GrayZone than what I at least used to see at the Real News and used to see at Democracy Now! And many in other places as well.
Yeah, well, Democracy Now! To me is worth talking about because it's such an important institution, and I learned so much from it, both as a viewer before I started working there, and then as a producer when I was there for over a decade. And to me, it used to set the standard, in my opinion, for adversarial journalism in the US. Not always, even during my time there, I think there were some serious oversights, like with Libya, for example. If you look back at our coverage initially, you can make the argument that we were basically promoting the regime change war.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I wasn't involved with that directly, at the time I didn't just have the knowledge that I have now to really notice it. But to our credit, though, if you look back, you'll see that not long after we did that, we did start bringing people in who were very critical of the Libya war, especially Vijay Prashad. So I do think that back then we did our best to make up for it. And then once I got really aware of what the reality of Libya was, how we destroyed that country, cynically used what was supposed to be a limited UN Security Council resolution to protect Benghazi, to destroy the country. I mean, once I got it, then I tried to correct it too when I got the chance to co-host the show. But in the last few years of the Trump era, so I left DN in early 2016. And without getting into personalities and individuals, I just think that we can learn a lot from manufacturing consent and how the propaganda model works. And one of the ways the propaganda model works, according to Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky, is this dynamic where the propaganda is so strong that these narrative red lines are laid down that say that if you cross this red line, you're not welcome, you're not acceptable, you aren't a part of the media system. And there is this subconscious allure of that for people who want to be accepted and don't want to be marginalized. And I think in the case of DN, unfortunately, there's just been repeated, on such key issues like the Syrian dirty war and on RussiaGate and on anything to do with China and basically anything to do with imperialism at this point, except for Israel and Palestine, where you have to be a real monster to, it's, and also inside the progressive left, it's, if you were to support Israel, there's no space for that. So it's not hard to be pro-Palestinian at this point because it's just so established now that you have to be a real monster to try to to go back on support for Palestinian rights. But in the case of Syria, in the case of RussiaGate, it's not that. And in fact, the dominant pull is towards accepting the mainstream narrative. And that's what Democracy Now! Has done. And I wouldn't even really care about all the awful guests they've had on if they were still interviewing people with a dissenting point of view. But they don't. Something happened at DN after I left where, they, at a certain point over the last 3 years or so, they've stopped interviewing anybody who challenges the line on Syria, who points out that the U.S. was waging a sadistic, dirty war. So Stephen F. Cohen, who I mentioned before, he was a guest all the time on DN, all the time. That's where I met him. But his last interview on DN was in April 2017, which meant that during the peak of the RussiaGate era for 3 years, with the exception of the point up until April 2017, Democracy Now! Didn't interview the country's foremost RussiaGate scholar and foremost debunker of the new Cold War. And that's because Stephen F. Cohen, I think, was telling the truth about not just RussiaGate, but also Syria. And I don't know exactly what happened behind the scenes for this dynamic, but my guess is that just the dynamic of manufacturing consent and wanting to be accepted and being scared of crossing red lines consciously or subconsciously intimidated Amy Goodman into following along. And I just, I've tried to tell them, I write them emails all the time saying, what are you guys doing? Why don't you have on a dissenting voice? But I can't get through. And to the point where I could go through so many examples, like on the OPCW scandal, right? Democracy Now! What really stood out in the Iraq War era, where all these other liberal outlets were going along with the Iraq War. DN was standing up against it and pointing out all the lies. And you can go through that many, many times over the years, where I think we did a great job. But when it comes to Syria, something like the OPCW scandal, where you have internal documents from the OPCW, you have whistleblowers, all the things that make for an incredible story, and all the things that an outlet like Democracy Now! Should be promoting, because it's whistleblowers standing up to injustice and censorship and exposing a pro-war deception. This is like DN's bread and butter. They've been on the side of those who are attacking the whistleblowers. Their only segment on the topic was with this guy, Brian Whitaker, who's a British journalist who is a fanatic supporter of the dirty war in Syria. And his attempts to engage on this topic of the OPCW scandal was to attack the whistleblowers and dismiss them. He even doxed one of them. So that was DN's only segment on this issue. And then when explosive leaks have come out, whether through WikiLeaks or in stories like mine on the GrayZone or in The Nation, they've just ignored it. And when occasionally they report it. So for example, a few months ago, the US and its allies blocked Jose Bustani, the former director general of the OPCW, who supports the whistleblowers. They blocked him from speaking at the UN Security Council, which is like unprecedented. And you have to wonder, why are they going so far as to prevent this distinguished diplomat from speaking, who, by the way, was pushed out of his job at the OPCW because he stood in the way of the Iraq War. When Democracy Now! Covered it, they misreported it and said that the UN had blocked him from speaking. So they were basically, not intentionally, but because they're just so credulous and sloppy, they were basically covering up for the Trump administration on blocking this guy from speaking, and overall in bombing Syria on false pretenses. So I don't know. I can't say exactly what the reason is. I just think that what has happened is shameful, and it speaks to how little space there is left inside progressive media to speak the truth. And that's why outlets like the GrayZone there's so much effort to demonize us. Like when you look at an article about us, like they don't engage with what we actually say, but they just make all the sleazy innuendo that we're backed by Russia because maybe some Russian diplomat retweeted one of our articles, or some Chinese diplomat, shared our story or commented positively on it. It's all with dumb innuendo because they can't rebut us on the facts. And it's a problem that goes beyond Democracy Now! Look at The Intercept, which has been equally, if not more terrible on things like RussiaGate and regime change, except for Glenn Greenwald, obviously. But it's just an issue. And I don't know the exact reason. I just know that it's a tragedy, especially for someone for whom DN means so much, and knowing what it used to be, knowing what it could be. It's a tragedy. And my only hope is that the public criticism that it gets from people like me and others will lead it to change, because there's no reason why it can't still reverse course and get back to being the sort of noble adversarial show that I think it is deep down at its essence, before the last few years have buried all that.
Yeah, I hear you. I appreciate that. The over the years, my critique of DN was always was based on the lack of reporting on domestic struggles. And at one point, I did even a study that showed that Democracy Now! Had less Black American guests than MSNBC based on amount of shows. After a study had come out criticizing MSNBC, and my point was, I don't care about the commercial press. I'm more interested in criticizing what is supposed to be an alternative, and such an important alternative. So And the one time I was in the new, what was then the new studio, or the newer, whatever, the new studios, for a meeting unrelated to Democracy Now, actually, I noted that the only brother in there was sweeping the floor, and I was just like, man, I think, you know, but
well,
yeah, go ahead.
Let me ask you though, don't you? I mean, I'm not sure if you've watched it. It's my sense though that domestically, DN has paid more attention to domestic struggles in recent years. I think as they've gotten so bad on foreign policy, I think at least domestically, they might have gotten better. That's actually my sense. Now, one critique I will make though is that, you know, DN used to have on people like Glenn Ford of Black Agenda Report, who is no longer there. So the space for Black leftist voices has shrunk. But I mean, have you followed recently? I mean,
no,
like,
I not closely enough. No, I haven't. That's what I'm saying. And I admit that caveat. I haven't paid enough attention lately to certainly for any kind of analysis. Although when I have seen, to your point about Glenn, when I have seen Black guests on, they're not left of the Democratic Party. So I think that's at least from what I can remember recently, at least. My one joke would be that if anybody really wants you know, one day when not that I would, but one day when I write a memoir and I tell the story of the time I sat down for a drink with Juan Gonzalez, that's the story I would want to tell. That's the I can't wait for that one day. But the one thing about Democracy Now that I would want to bring up just real quick now is that I was fascinated that, and I don't know if you all have covered this and I've missed it, but the absence of the debate around Michael Moore's or his company's Planet of the Humans documentary that I know Democracy Now ran headline critiques of, but never invited, and even from Naomi Klein. And I remember, you know, even earlier in the year, Naomi and Michael Moore had been on a platform together, talking about, you know, working together and all this. Then she critiques the film, and there's no response or no invitation. And since I know Democracy Now covers a lot of environmental issues, I would have thought that they would have been hot to host a debate around that, and they didn't mention that at all. I thought still think it's shocking, at least unless I've missed something. But
listen. Yeah, listen, the Amy Goodman that I know and work with had a lot of courage. There was a real willingness to discuss controversial issues. So, you know, one of our most famous debates was when Glenn Ford debated Michael Eric Dyson about Obama. And that's what I loved about DN, is they had those kind of debates. And I don't know what's happened in the last few years, but certainly you don't see that anymore. So anything that's controversial on the left, you know, that's where there's this perceived red line, they don't touch. The Michael Moore thing is a good example. Look at Julian Assange. Julian Assange's extradition hearing, when it was going on, there was a period when they just pretty much ignored it. They then have tried to make up for it recently, but you know, they so much critical information that used to be in there, and that I used to personally work very hard to include and make sure is not there anymore. So, for example, I actually looked this up the other day, because I was looking up something on Assange, and you know, the spying on Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy, we recently found out that it was conducted by the CIA, which enlisted this Spanish firm UC Global, and a middleman for that was Sheldon Adelson's company. You know, the mega Trump donor, casino billionaire. So Sheldon Adelson's company was used as a middleman between the CIA and UC Global. And I was curious to see if Deanne has ever mentioned that, and they hadn't. So it's just one more example of just so many things that we used to highlight and talk about and do segments on are just not covered. And that's a case where, again, Assange, who used to be all the time on DN, because of this huge propaganda narrative that's been constructed to demonize him, especially since 2016, but also because the entire bipartisan establishment hates him. Not just, you know, like forget the Democratic Party emails in 2016. They hate him for exposing war crimes. You know, I also think if you look at DN's coverage of Assange, it's gotten less friendly over the years. I think now that he's gotten this victory where where the UK judge ruled against his extradition, I think now it will become safer to champion him again. But it's been, look, I could go on forever about all the critical issues where I think Democracy Now, as good as I think it's been on domestic issues, has really dropped the ball when it comes to the national security state and imperialism. And unfortunately, and that's where we need adversarial media the most, because it's easy to be good on domestic policy, to support Medicare for all, and to oppose racism. Like, again, like only.
Although it's harder for some apparently lately with this force the vote thing.
Right. That's true. Which they also didn't cover.
They didn't cover that.
Did not cover out. No, of course not. No, because there's and that's part of the dynamic fueling the attacks on force the vote that I want to say is that Jimmy Dore represents a part of the left that I don't think a lot of these, whatever you want to call them, progressives, liberals, don't want to acknowledge. They don't want to just debate with them the issues on the merits, in part because they don't want to legitimate their stances on other issues. So Jimmy Dore has been great on RussiaGate. He called RussiaGate out from the start. He also called out the Syrian chemical weapons allegations as fake from the start. He was right. And people that went along with RussiaGate and with Syria dirty war propaganda don't want to legitimate someone and allow them into a leftist space. And so instead they've made this about Jimmy's tone, and they've made this about this is not the right time. And, I think there are some legit tactical issues around force the vote. And I also think the importance of it, I'm worried about exaggerating the importance of it personally, but certainly the attacks on Jimmy and the attempts to dismiss him immediately by bringing up his purported views on other issues was really cynical. I think that's what's happening here is there's a part of the left that doesn't want to associate leftism with being consistent. So not just applying your leftism to US borders, but applying it to around the world, and not just applying it to safe issues like, Medicare for all and racism where everyone's on board, but to the tougher issues that require more thought, like imperialism and RussiaGate.
Hey man, well, to your principled nature, you resisted that whole thing about tone. I mean, I keep joking. Jimmy sold me as a viewer when he called you a cuck on the show for supporting Biden, and I was like, damn. And I said, and I thought you were very gracious in that. And I know he's somewhat joking. I know you all have a relationship or whatever, but I said, damn. But my real point in that, what I was impressed by was that honestly at the time that I was a little bit jealous of what I'm simplifying as the white versus black left, is that in black left media spaces, particularly before the election, there was no debate at all. Like granted, I wouldn't have wanted to get into something where even jokingly people are name calling like that, but you at least graciously accepted the discussion based on principle and policy and didn't just say, well, he's wrong because he called me a name and yelled into the microphone. But my whole point watching it at the time was I really appreciate the disagreement and the debate that you were willing to engage with him, because I was not seeing that in those of us who were in black political spaces saying voting for Biden is unacceptable were completely demonized and omitted and not allowed to even enter the conversation, and were never even welcomed for a discussion or debate in most spaces. So anyway, I appreciated that exchange.
It's so funny that he won you over because he called me a cuck.
That was it, but primarily because but again, my point is but again, my point is that really my point is what won me over was the willingness to engage in the debate, and the demonstration of you being willing to accept it, even though I get it was somewhat joke. I don't think he really was going at you like that, but just the willingness to do that, and his willingness to aggressively defend a position I agreed with, but to welcome someone who disagreed with him, even if it was to yell a little bit or whatever, I thought was important. At least that was really my point about being won over. It was that he was willing to do in his platform what I'm not seeing happen in some of the black spaces that I would like to see that conversation have had taken place.
And I think Jimmy's a rare exception because if you look, again, as we're just saying, democracy now has not had much in the way of inter-left debates. And when they do, they're pretty superficial. And I think it's a problem because we should be willing to have debates. And I mean, look, I certainly push back on people who were attacking Jimmy for his tone. That doesn't mean, though, that, look, some people, I don't blame some people for being uncomfortable with Jimmy's tone. For some, it's not for everybody. I personally like it. I love what Jimmy does. And when he calls me names, I find it's funny, whatever. Like, it's like, it's his shtick. And like, I don't take it personally. And I don't care about name calling. I just care about what the substance is. So it doesn't really bother me. But that was a really telling episode that people, instead of debating I think a very important tactical issue is, do we want to just blindly reelect Nancy Pelosi, or should progressives use their leverage to get something, instead of just debating that, it became all about Jimmy's tone, and it became, these dumb accusations about Jimmy that he took money from Assad. And by the way, from people making these allegations were people who, pushed RussiaGate, who supported the dirty war in Syria, didn't care about Assange, and even demonized him, like at the Young Turks. But, I never argued before that they should be canceled or dismissed, and we shouldn't take their argument seriously because they had all these awful views on all these other things. So it was so curious to me that they were trying to cancel Jimmy for his accurate positions on other issues, like on Syria and RussiaGate.
Yeah, somebody in the comments was asking if people really like the yelling, that type of character Jimmy is. And my thing is, it's not the yelling that was attractive to me. It's the willingness to engage people in his his colleagues in debate, and to take a position that was not, the norm. That was what was attractive. So I'm not, and in fact, I'm really not, I don't, always respond well to the kind of demonstrative and the performance and stuff. I just like the debate. And I just was not seeing that in other spaces. So I really appreciated that. Look, Aaron, listen, man, I've been a big fan of your work for a long time, and of your father. So I appreciate the time you've shared here, and I appreciate the conversations you have with your father. I hope you guys keep doing more of those. I think they're fascinating. They're great. And I'd certainly appreciate your work at the GrayZone and with Pushback. So thanks again for joining me.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Jared. Thank you.
Anytime, man. Take care. Listen, everybody, thanks for joining me, and thanks for joining us. There's a lot of comments and questions that I don't think that we got to. Please bring them back up in another session, or maybe we can even schedule a separate session just to talk about some of these issues. There was a question about resisting propaganda. I was trying to pay attention to Aaron. There was a lot of details in what he was saying that I was trying to pay attention to, so I might have missed some of the comments and questions. But I want to just be very clear, because if I caught some of it correctly, I want to just be very clear about my interest in hosting Aaron and others from the GrayZone, and just in general, others maybe outside of the general racial or political ideological focus that is usually mine and ours here. And it's not to debate them about what Black and brown and African and colonized people should be doing, or to even ask their input on that. It is to get information that I think that they're providing that not enough of us are dealing with, at least at the levels that I think we should. And I do think, in terms of the international coverage that they do, particularly, that more of us need to be involved with, attuned to that, not only because we should just, I think, know more about how the world is functioning, what's happening in it, but I think there's a lot of clues and analyses that are being applied elsewhere that can and should be applied more here into some of the domestically held struggles. I hope at least that much is appreciated. And again, because I certainly appreciate these conversations and you all joining me for them, please like, share, subscribe, consider becoming a member. And I promise you there are always ongoing attempts to make collective use of what is done here by me as an individual, or even under the nominally individual name of I Mix What I Like, which is really not meant to be individual at all. So please be patient, consider going out on a limb and trusting me a little bit. Or if not, just hold on and stick around for some of these announcements coming very soon, and maybe consider becoming a member then. But in the meantime, please at least do like, share, and subscribe. And we'll catch you at 5 o'clock Eastern for our discussion of the transnational history and politics of reparations. And then after that, Towards a Black Agenda with Margaret Kimberly of blackagendareport.com. So Until then, without further ado, to you I say peace. If you are willing to fight for it, as did Fred Hampton, and we'll catch you the next edition of I Mix What I Like Live. Peace, everybody.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like.